Well, thank you for joining us. My name is Cyril Kormos. I am co-chairing these sessions of our World Heritage on Climate and Biodiversity this month, along with Alec Marr and Brendan Mackey. Just a quick introduction of our World Heritage. It's really a citizen-led grassroots effort to bring more attention to the World Heritage Convention and both the benefits it could provide if it were operating the way it should, and the challenges with the way it's currently going about its business. It's an initiative led by experts in the World Heritage field, both on the cultural and on the natural side. And it's really motivated by the feeling, I think, shared by everyone involved, that World Heritage sites are exceptional, that the World Heritage Convention is an exceptional mechanism and could be very important going forward in heritage conservation and in nature conservation generally, if it were to function the way it should. And a shared concern that the convention is increasingly becoming politicized and that this process is going on for a very long time, and that it's not only continuing but in fact getting worse, and this year that we really in fact crossed a line in a number of places where some egregious decisions were taken, and the concern is really growing that we are seeing damage to World Heritage sites around the world. And we are also seeing sites inscribed on the World Heritage List that probably don't merit that level of recognition and distinction. Our World Heritage Initiative is a grassroots effort to try to generate a response to this increased politicization and to advocate for the convention to operate the way we feel it was clearly intended to. And in particular, to take advantage of a unique opportunity, which is that next year is the 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention. And that is something that will provide a significant platform. What we are trying to achieve with this particular symposium over the next few days is to give an overview of some of the range of issues related to climate change rights and nature conservation. And that's something that we will do today in this first set of presentations. We will also tomorrow have a session dedicated towards looking at threats to World Heritage sites in particular, and we'll have a number of recorded sessions online for people to view, and then a strategy discussion at this same time that Alec and I will lead, and hopefully with Ivan Blokov as a third moderator. And the next day will focus on some climate impacts to sites in particular, and we'll have a session looking at impacts to places like the Sundarbans and the Great Barrier Reef, et cetera, and talk about how to mitigate those impacts. And the last day, which will be fully recorded sessions available online, will be on nature culture linkages. Before we get into presentations, I did want to say one thing, which is on the climate and biodiversity side in particular. And it's a theme that we're going to try to come back to today and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, which is that there's this sense that the climate change is just a threat to sites, that it's an unfortunate reality that there's this phenomenon that's beyond the control of any particular state party that is eroding and degrading some of our favorite places. A major theme of this symposium is to qualify that perspective and to say, yes, climate change is a major threat, and we should be concerned about what's happening to these sites. But we also need to understand World Heritage Sites as a critical part of the response to climate change. And this is something that Professor Brendan Mackey will help us understand, which is that the World Heritage Convention is uniquely situated to respond to threats from climate change, because World Heritage Sites are large places with ecological integrity, which can store huge amounts of carbon and also absorb more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere going forward. So the theme here is understanding climate as a threat and understanding World Heritage Sites as a response to the threat from climate change. So it's both sides of the coin, and I think that's a fundamentally important point. I don't want to go on too long. I just want to say that what the objective of these sessions is really to first get some information out on the linkages between nature and biodiversity and ecosystem integrity and climate change, and how it's really a two-way street, how climate impacts biodiversity, but how biodiversity can also mitigate climate change. The other purpose of these sessions is to start to think about how we can get better organized as a conservation community concerned about some of the most spectacular, exceptional places on this planet. We have an opportunity coming up in a few months with the 50th anniversary of the convention next November. What do we do between now and then to bring more attention to this convention and how it could function better? And related to that is, what are the specific measures that we could take in terms of proposing policy change within the convention? What are the places where we could propose either procedural or policy reform to make the convention more effective? And in particular, we'll get some advice for that aspect of things from Earth Justice in terms of the climate policy within the World Heritage Convention. But other ideas generally would also be very helpful, and I hope that's something that we'll cover tomorrow in our discussion with Alec and Ivan. What can we do as a conservation community to help right this ship? I think I will leave it at that for now, Alec, unless you have something to say. I think what I'll do you want to say a few words, or do you think you'll save it for your...
A few words, just leading into my own presentation. Thanks, Cyril.
Okay, all right. Perfect. What I'll do, Brendan, if that's okay, is I'll introduce you and you can go ahead and share your screen and give your talk. Does that work? I think you're on mute.
Yes, that's fine. Thanks, sir.
Okay, perfect. Professor Brendan Mackey is based in Brisbane, Australia. He's the director of the Griffith Climate Action Beacon at Griffith, in the Griffith Climate Change Response Program at Griffith University. He is also a member of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Working Group 2, which focuses on adaptation. So Brendan is a climate expert, very involved in the 6th assessment report that the IPCC is currently working on delivering, with the first report from Working Group 1 already published, and the next 2 coming soon. Brendan's also a forest ecologist who's got experience working in basically all the forest types around the world, tropical, temperate, and boreal. So he brings together expertise on climate ecology and has also worked extensively with Indigenous peoples around the planet and on the Earth Charter. So a very unique blend of skills. And what Brendan will focus on today, this morning for him in Australia, is really the relationship between ecosystem integrity and climate. And it's a link that is getting more attention and that people are starting to understand, but that unfortunately still is not understood with the kind of specificity and depth that we really need, because this is a really critical dimension as climate change accelerates and the impacts get increasingly catastrophic. So Brendan, over to you, and please give us a talk on ecosystem integrity, biodiversity, and climate.
Yes, thanks, Cyril, and for me, it's good morning to everyone. I'd also just like to mention that I have also got extensive experience at applying World Heritage natural criteria and mixed criteria to potential World Heritage sites, including sites that have been listed in Australia. So I'm also very familiar with all of the World Heritage criteria, the kind of evidence that's used to support them, and in applying them in different contexts. Mainly natural, but increasingly mixed and with cultural landscapes concerning Indigenous peoples. So let me share my screen. And Cyril, I understand you just want me to talk for 7 or 10 minutes, is that correct?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Now, just let me know, Cyril, if this all shares correctly, so that what can you see now? Is that
Yeah, it looks good.
you can see the PowerPoint okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So Cyril said, I just want to make a few observations about World Heritage and what we call ecosystem integrity and climate change. It's clear that I think that there are certain ecosystem types. So I'm talking about natural heritage, but also cultural landscapes in the context of Indigenous people and their customary lands. There are clearly ecosystems that are highly climate sensitive, and probably the most climate sensitive ecosystem we have are tropical coral reefs. I'm sure we'll hear more about them later in this session. They're highly climate sensitive because of the coral bleaching effect from marine heat waves. And climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity and duration of marine heat waves, especially in the tropics. And this is causing this coral bleaching phenomena to increasingly occur at a frequency greater than the natural regenerative time of these systems. So there's no doubt that for certain climate sensitive ecosystem types, climate change is a huge issue. But when we come to the terrestrial ecosystems, we're presented really with a different ecological context. And that's what I want to touch upon now in the next few slides. And I want to particularly talk about forest ecosystems. There are many World Heritage areas, large World Heritage areas that are dominantly forested. They're dominated by natural forests, primary forests, and if they're very large areas, they're sometimes referred to as intact forest landscapes. And they actually, if you like, interact with climate and human influence climate change very differently to tropical coral reefs. The other interesting thing about forests is that they really lie at the nexus of many of our global problems and challenges. We know that deforestation and degradation causes habitat loss, that this is the major cause of species extinctions. what we often don't think about is this relationship between species and an ecosystem. And that's what I want to say a bit more today. We also know that deforestation and degradation are major sources of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's because ecosystems, and particularly forest ecosystems, store huge amounts of carbon. There's more carbon in forests than what there is in the atmosphere at the moment. We also know that global warming increases risk of certain vector-borne diseases. And we also know that forest fragmentation promotes pathogen spillover. And we also know that forest loss and degradation reduces ecosystem services for sustainable livelihoods for Indigenous communities and forest-dependent local communities. So currently, our way of looking at these problems is very siloed. We look at biodiversity extinctions as a separate problem to the climate change problem. We look at issues of sustainable development and meeting the SDGs separately from both of them. And now we've got, it's not that we've never had a pandemic before, but COVID has become a very dominant pandemic. But actually, those four problems circled there on the left are not independent. They're closely coupled, and forests and what we do with forests and how we use and manage them lay at the nexus of the solutions to those problems. And really, this is where World Heritage can help. And that's because extensive natural World Heritage landscapes, and again, I'm focusing on terrestrial, especially primary forests and intact forest landscapes, have a high level of what we call ecosystem integrity. And protecting them, protecting and conserving these areas helps address a lot of these global issues that we were talking about. So what do I mean by ecosystem integrity? Well, and this is a photograph of a World Heritage listed landscape, intact forest landscape from the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. This is hundreds of thousands of hectares of primary temperate forest, including temperate rainforest. And because it's protected and has a high level of integrity, it retains all its evolved characteristic biodiversity. This means it has healthy ecological processes and retains all its self-organizing capacity. And this gives that ecosystem certain qualities that are lacking in a degraded and fragmented forest landscape. These systems are more stable. They are more able to resist external pressures and shocks to the system. They're more resilient. When they are disturbed, they are very effective and more able to recover and regenerate and return to their pre-disturbed condition. And because of their high levels of biodiversity at all levels, they are much more adaptive. They have adaptive capacity. I think COVID, if it teaches us anything, I would hope it reminds us that evolution has not stopped. Evolution is an ongoing process, and at the basis of evolution is natural selection, working with the available biodiversity to select those phenotypes and species and community interactions that are best adapted to the changing conditions. So an intact natural landscape that's protected by World Heritage has those characteristics of its biodiversity and ecological processes, is more stable, resilient and adaptive than a degraded and disrupted system. And this means it can provide all these benefits that address these problems. It stores very large amounts of carbon, and forests continue to grow for hundreds and hundreds and thousands, in fact, thousands of years. The whole ecosystem continues to sequester and store carbon. They enable us to conserve our biodiversity. they provide a whole range of other ecosystem services, especially water. The cleanest water comes from these forests. They help avoid pandemics. This is particularly, but particularly an issue in tropical forests, where, as I said, it's the fragmentation and eroding into what was intact forest landscapes that increases the connections between wildlife, domestic animals and humans, and the spillover of passages from the wildlife reservoir into human systems. So again, World Heritage landscapes, in protecting those forests, keeping them intact, helps prevent those spillovers, and actually is, part of a comprehensive approach to preventing further pandemics. And of course, in many parts of the world, especially, but not only in the tropics, also in boreal and temperate forests, these are the traditional homes for Indigenous peoples. So in terms of their livelihoods and in terms of their culture and their cultural relationships with these landscapes, World Heritage provides an extraordinarily important level of protection. So Cyril, I'm happy to stop there. I see my time is up, and happy to take questions and listen to the next speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. If there are questions for Brendan, some quick questions, can we have them now? And if there isn't, I'll just launch into my presentation. But if anyone has a quick question, please go ahead. And Brendan, you stopped sharing. No questions. Okay. So I will share my screen. Can you all see my presentation?
Yes. Yes, we can, sir.
Great. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to build a little bit on what Brendan said, and maybe provide a bit more of a World Heritage specific overlay on the key principle that Brendan described, which is the relationship between the integrity of the ecosystem and its ability to fight climate change, both to resist the threats from climate change and to draw down huge carbon stocks and keep them safely stored for centuries to millennia. This slide is probably a diagram that everybody is quite familiar with at this point, but it looks at, it's from the IPCC, and it looks at what we need to do in terms of reducing carbon dioxide emissions over the next few decades if we want to avoid catastrophic climate impacts, which of course we're already experiencing in many parts of the world right now, but which will get a whole lot worse. But anyways, as you can see, we have emissions have to fall off a cliff if we really want to avoid disaster. And I think that what the recent IPCC Working Group 1 report tells us in part is that things are getting worse faster and worse than we thought they would be at this point. And so we may have even less time than we thought, which is a very sobering and scary thought. So anyway, basically what this slide tells us is that we have a few decades to get down to zero emissions and then get below zero by after mid-century. So we're really up against it and running out of time. We know that climate change is a rapidly growing threat to World Heritage sites. It's the #1 threat right now. A third of the sites are reporting serious impacts from climate change, and it's also the most the biggest future threat. It's the #1 anticipated threat in the future. Over half of World Heritage Sites anticipate that climate change is going to be a growing threat in coming years. We know that the threat of climate change is mirrored by a serious decline in biodiversity, plant and animal species around the world. And I won't go through all the numbers on this because it's just very depressing. But there are some here on your screen, and what we can see is that wildlife populations are collapsing. They're shrinking all the time, and species are going extinct much faster than they ever have before. And it's due to human impacts, basically. So those are the numbers. The numbers, like climate change, are getting significantly worse. And it's scary to see these statistics. Scientists are generally fairly conservative people, but the IPCC and the IPBES report are very unambiguous, very clear that we've got a serious problem on our hands. And we know that threats to World Heritage Sites generally are on the increase, not just from climate change, but from infrastructure development, roads, resource extraction. All of these are chipping away at the boundaries of these sites, and in many cases even well within World Heritage Sites, and causing serious destruction and degradation. So climate change is still the biggest threat, but we have a lot of other things like invasive alien species, tourism, infrastructure, oil and gas, mining, large dams, et cetera, et cetera. And this provides some sense of what's happening. You can see the logging in beech forests in Europe. You can see the excision at the bottom left of the area in Mount Nimba in Guinea, where they made room for a mine to go in. You can see at the bottom the dam and the flooding area in the Selous, and also the uranium mine that was excised from the Selous a few years ago. And there in the middle, you can see Wood Buffalo National Park, and the oil sands area, and what a huge impact that is. And we'll go into more of these, more detail on some of these examples in some of the podcasts that we're going to put online on the Our World Heritage site, which will be available tomorrow. But as Brendan said, one of the important messages here is not just that World Heritage Sites are under threat, but that ecosystems contain huge amounts of carbon. And that if that carbon is released as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because of clearing forests or building mines or flooding large areas, that carbon dioxide in those ecosystems could easily put us over the tipping points for catastrophic climate impacts, regardless of what we do with fossil fuels. So clearly we need to reduce fossil fuel emissions. That's critical and goes without saying. But a lot of people don't understand this crucial point, that even if we were to eliminate fossil fuel emissions, if we continue to degrade and clear ecosystems, we may trigger catastrophic climate change regardless. And that's a fundamentally important and critical point. So the point that Brendan was making is that climate and biodiversity are in fact interrelated, because the more the ecosystem maintains its integrity, meaning that the more undisturbed it is and the more it can retain all of its plant and animal species and all of its ecological processes, the more carbon it can store, and the more resistant it is to disturbance, and the more resilient it is to disturbance when disturbance does occur, and the more adaptive it is in the face of global change. So biodiversity and conservation and climate change are very much two sides of the same coin. They're not just closely interrelated. In the context of land use, you can say they're almost the same issue. So it's this nexus is fundamental, and we are increasingly promoting in policy circles the concept of ecosystem integrity as vital, both from a climate perspective and a biodiversity conservation perspective. So I won't repeat this because I just said it, but this concept of ecosystem integrity is integrated into many of the most important international biodiversity mechanisms, conservation mechanisms that we have. It was in the came out of the UNCCD in Rio in 1992. It's since been integrated into the Biodiversity Convention as a result of some work we did in 2018 with the government of Costa Rica in Egypt. It's also in the preamble to the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Convention. So it's a fundamental concept. It's growing in importance, and we can't underscore enough how important it is to maintain, and how the World Heritage Convention is in fact uniquely situated to address ecosystem integrity, precisely because the concept of outstanding universal value, which is the standard for creating a World Heritage Site, includes as one of its three pillars the concept of integrity. So this is a convention that is specifically designed to ensure that the greatest places on Earth are not degraded and that they maintain their full capacity to protect the diversity of life on this planet and to provide the ecosystem services that we all depend on. So this is an important and useful policy mechanism, and we can't emphasize that enough. The other point about World Heritage Sites that make them so important in this discussion on ecosystem integrity is that the World Heritage Convention has systematically, over the decades, since 1972, protected very, very large areas. And, you know, it's not uncommon for areas, you know, 3, 4, 5 million hectares to get protected. It happens every few years. And the numbers on the marine side are even more extraordinary. This slide is a little bit outdated because it doesn't show the French Southern Antarctic territories, which is 70 million hectares, and by far the largest World Heritage Site ever created. And why that didn't get more attention when it was inscribed a few years ago, I'm still not sure. But anyway, the point is that the World Heritage Convention not only emphasizes integrity, which is an increasingly important concept policy-wise and in its application in conservation, but it also, the convention also facilitates very, very large landscape, land and seascape conservation. So that's fundamentally important. So the key message that we are trying to convey here is that, yes, World Heritage Sites are under extreme threat from climate change and from a range of industrial activities and infrastructure construction and development around the planet. But that the convention is nonetheless a key tool to fight climate change and to ensure the integrity is maintained around the world if it functions as it's supposed to. And the point that we were going to try to cover, and I don't know if Chrissy is going to be able to join us today, but if she doesn't, we'll have her presentation on another day.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Okay, great. A critical point is that you know, Indigenous conservation and community-led conservation is fundamental here, and that we're not talking about just creating national parks. We're not talking about an exclusionary approach. If the convention were working the way it should, and if it recognized rights, and if rights were supported, and if communities were compensated the way they should be for providing the kinds of services that they do to the entire planet, the World Heritage Convention could be an important engine in driving a new way forward for conservation. And it could be tremendously progressive and forward thinking. And there are signs that this has happened, that this could happen in the recent past. We saw some wonderful examples come out in 2018 from Canada with Mackey, from Russia with the extension to the central Cihote-Alin site, and from Chiribiquete in Colombia, which raised a lot of hopes, which were then quickly moderated by developments this year, which were very, very disappointing with the Kangkrachan site in Thailand. But the point is here that if sites are well managed, and right now only about half are well managed, so that number needs to go up. If rights were respected and supported and recognized and integrated into World Heritage sites and World Heritage designations as they should be and must be, then the convention could be a very important engine for pulling conservation and social justice and forward and heritage conservation forward together. And you know, it would be a very remarkable thing if we could get there. So the sense is that this year was very disappointing and very problematic in that it was very politicized, and yet still that there is this hope that this convention, if we could get it functioning the right way, could be very important and a very positive force for change. But that's a very difficult challenge to meet. But I just want to, before turning it over to Chrissy, if she's ready, and if not, we'll go to Alec. But I just want to leave you with this quote from the UN Center for Research on Epidemiology of Disasters. It's, whoops. It's a very powerful quote. It's in the foreword, looking at the human cost of disasters. And this is, it struck me because this is a UN document, and they're usually, they're not always this eloquent, but the quote is, "It is baffling that we willingly and knowingly continue to sow the seeds of our own destruction, despite the science and evidence that we are turning our only home into an uninhabitable hell for millions of people. It really is all about governance if we want to deliver this planet from the scourge of poverty, further loss of species and biodiversity, the explosion of urban risk, and the worst consequences of global warming." These are the issues that we want to explore in this symposium and over the next few days. And I hope that you can all join the next few sessions, and in particular tomorrow, that we can get together and talk about some ways forward for how to get this convention to work better. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing. Chrissy, thank you for joining. I don't know if you are prepared at this point to say a few words. I think you're on mute. But can I just introduce you before you?
Sure.
So Chrissy Grant is, thank you for joining, is an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elder, and has been working for more than 35 years with communities on cultural and natural resource management and with traditional owner groups to identify their cultural values, their heritage management, conservation and protection. She was the director of Indigenous Heritage with the Australian government and oversaw the implementation of the National Heritage List with Butch Bim being the first place listed as a cultural landscape a few years ago. And she's a founding member and currently chairs the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage, providing a voice for Indigenous peoples about their concerns on nominations and reports at World Heritage Committee meetings. So someone with extensive international and Australian networks within many international instruments, the Convention on Biological Diversity, agencies like the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity and the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So a deeply experienced and respected voice. Thank you, Chrissy.
Thank you. I'm just going by your email, Cyril, in sort of providing a little bit of background for people about the forum. We are a really new NGO. It was the proposal was put to the World Heritage Committee meeting in 2017 in Poland. Then it was launched in 2018 in Bahrain. And in 2019 in Baku, that was the first time we really had the opportunity to represent some of the Indigenous peoples around their nominations. So there wasn't a lot, but we could see what was going on and the way that things were run, and the lack of inclusion of Indigenous people's views and input into the nomination, and that starts from the very beginning. In Australia, we work differently. It goes on the National Heritage List first before it can be even considered to be, on the World Heritage List. Other governments and nations don't obviously have that same process, but as you mentioned, Budge Bim was the very first site that was registered on the National Heritage List in 2002, I think it was, after the legislation came into place. It was just my honour that I was able to be there when it was 1001 listed places on the World Heritage List. It was a very emotional time. But we have been trying to build our profile across Indigenous communities, particularly those with existing World Heritage properties, and sort of where there are some concerns. I'll talk a little bit about Karankachang in a moment, but we're communicating with communities on the ground. We have representatives in each of the 5 regions. And the thing that I suppose I notice is the inconsistency of the way the UN works. For instance, World Heritage has 5 regions, whereas the CBD has 7 regions. I can't explain it. But in 2019, we did have a presence, apart from making a couple of statements. I think we had made 3 statements in all to support the Indigenous peoples. We had 2 side events, and that was looking at, Indigenous peoples' engagement in World Heritage processes and getting the experience of those people that are already have their places on the World Heritage List, and probably in the first few years, what were the challenges and that sort of thing. So they've been looking after it, after the country, well before it went on to the World Heritage List. But the processes of having either a government or a management authority actually, taking control and responsibility for the management of the World Heritage and its OUVs is something a little bit new to them and challenging for them. And so I would say that it would be the case for a lot of the World Heritage, places where Indigenous people are on the ground. They're doing the management. They've been doing it for thousands of years, and to have somebody come over the top and sort of say, well, you need to do this and this and this now, is probably a little bit against the grain for them. But 2019 was also the International Year of the Indigenous Languages. And so we had a back-to-back side event, which was, I think, feedback was that it was one of the best side events that, sort of was put on for 2019. And, I called on people from around the 5 regions who had World Heritage properties that could give us an indication of, sort of why that, why the place, even though it might not have been listed for its cultural values, but why the place was really important to them, and a connection to language. And language is the, sort of the basis of, their identity and their practices and traditions and that sort of thing. So, it is really important for Indigenous people to be able to maintain, their cultural values, their cultural traditions and practices, no matter what sort of management is over, a place, or what sort of rating they may have. But in regard to this last virtual World Heritage Committee meeting, we found that we felt that it was very disappointing from the point of view of the process, from the point of view of, sort of, what can you say in 1 minute? It's just, I know that there was a time issue, but there has got to be some reality in this. And what is the use of having a say after the decision is made? That we have no opportunity to give them some hard facts from, communities that we've been talking with. And we had been, I think I was in about 3 Zooms with the Quran people and the communities and the organisations in Asia that support them. And, sort of even with the Special Rapporteur, Francisco Cully, he joined one of the Zoom meetings as well. And, it was nothing new to him. It was a continuation of what was going on previously. I understand that the nomination went up in about 2018 or 17 or something like that in the beginning, and it kept getting deferred or referred. And so nothing had changed on the ground. And who, for us, it's like, who are they accountable to then if nothing changes on the ground, and the advice is sort of given but not taken. But it is something very different. As I said, the different UN bodies act very differently. And you mentioned the Convention of Biological Diversity. The IPLCs, which is the Indigenous Peoples and Local Communities, are the very first NGO that ever comes after the state parties. And our input is heard, it's taken into account, it's included in some of the documents if we're supported by a state party, and it goes right through to being included in the final document for the CBD in matters of science, in matters of implementation, so it goes right across the CBD. The World Heritage has their own Indigenous engagement policy even, and I think that might have been done around about 2016, 2017. And it doesn't seem that, sort of they're implementing any of that. There are other things as well, sort of that would allow the World Heritage Committee to operate differently and a bit more fairly in regard to taking into account Indigenous people's views on these things. But one of the things that we think, the criterion needs to be changed. The criterion needs to not have natural without the cultural in it, particularly for landscapes where Indigenous peoples are. And that would be across most of the landscapes and national parks and things like that. Sort of from my own experience, we have national parks, which is part of the Wet Tropics World Heritage property. And we back on to like our two World Heritage properties, abut against each other with the Wet Tropics and the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. So it's sort of the way the procedures of how they were rolling it out, I suppose. And as I said, this is the first virtual one, but this is only the second actual meeting that I've been to. And it just seemed very strange in the way that they were, rolling it out and sort of being hard-lined about, if and when you could speak, for how long, all that sort of thing, but certainly not taking into account, sort of the information or the advice that we were providing, given that we were getting it from the people on the ground. In regards to Karang Kachang, sort of the people were very scared. They're not against the World Heritage property being on the property being on the World Heritage list, but they were, being treated unfairly because their traditional practices of rotational farming was considered to be detrimental to the OUVs. And I would have said if they've been doing that for thousands of years, that would have added to the OUVs being maintained and the conservation of the park. But it's the human rights aspect of it, and it's becoming, we're becoming aware of a lot of human rights breaches across a number of different World Heritage properties where people are forced off their lands, their houses are burned, they're arrested and put in jail for no reason at all, and they're even killed. And, so for me, I would not like to be on a committee where, sort of this is on my head. And this is something that we really wanted to stress with the World Heritage Committee. But we didn't have the opportunity. Neither did the Special Rapporteur have much of an opportunity, and I think he was cut down to 2 minutes or maybe even 1 minute, I can't remember. But, sort of he's dealing with this stuff all the time. And it's something that they, had never been asked about. They've never had free, prior informed consent on the issue. So it's not about the, the World Heritage listing as such. It's about the whole process of how it came about, that they weren't included, they weren't, sort of part of the whole process. There was no free, prior informed consent. There was absolutely no taking into account all of the, sort of atrocities of, human life and sort of unfair treatment of human beings in where this is their country, this is where they live. So we're hoping that, sort of we might get the opportunity to be able to present something at the General Assembly to, sort of look at some of the practices and procedures, and to also look at, sort of, I've got a meeting with IUCN, sort of looking at seeing how we can have a look at the reframing, I suppose, of the criteria. And I think that needs to happen first and foremost. Because if you take a landscape, you know, for Indigenous peoples, there's songlines, there's storylines, there's features that tell a story, there's connection. And so it can't be separated at all. So, yeah, so, you know, sort of that's probably all I've got at the moment. But yeah, whether you wanted to ask questions or talk about something else.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Chrissy. And I'll just open it up now. I know Chrissy may have to go relatively soon. So if there are questions for Chrissy, please don't hesitate. Raise your hand, or just, there's not many of us right now. So go ahead and unmute if you'd like to ask a question.
Yep.
Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It's sort of really 1:30 in the morning, so I'm just gonna not have my camera on. Thanks, Chrissy, for this. This is really, really important because you've then highlighted the issue of the process. And perhaps we have to have a simple thing, is that rather than the operational guidelines before a recommendation, before a site could be nominated, rather than just simply recommending that there should be connections to stakeholders, however they want to be called, but that within the words of the operational guidelines, it must be countersigned. And I think that we've seen this on the issue of the deleting of Dresden, and the issue was, in fact, the people were not signed on the nomination. So I think that this is a critical point. So therefore, what I'm think it is in the process is that there's a circularity between the state party, between the committee, and between the stakeholders. And I think that what we're looking at is actually having the committee as a whip, and it's not going to work that way, because it's essentially the conflict of national interests which are taking place at each time. When they took off the onyx, when we had the World Heritage meeting that was in Christchurch, where the Oman took off the site there of the oryx.
The oryx, yeah.
Yeah, that was again sort of national interest. So the question really is that how do we bring about that the elements which you're saying, Chrissy, cannot get outside the boundaries of the state party. They are not even allowed to move out into the global sphere without having this background. And I therefore see that this is a really critical point. So the circularity between the state party, between the stakeholders, and between the World Heritage Committee. My second point really is, first of all, it was some beautiful photographs, Cyril, in your presentation. What I'm looking at, it's really beyond the property. So what World Heritage has given to us is the concept of integrity, about how much do we need to protect the values, and we need space beyond ourselves. And I can say, okay, how much beyond do I need to be able to have the activity? So therefore, when I look at the Great Barrier Reef, it's much wider than that. What Cyril was saying is that the extension and the importance of this is, as I said, beyond the site. So it's, and I think that this is another aspect of it, is that we tend to put it within the box. And how can we get these activities to be changing the mindset of management, which is in fact, which the World Heritage should be an example of good practice, and how this could be then taken to other parts. So I think this is really what my comments, which I'd like to say. And it really, I think that we in culture have got a lot to learn from nature. Every time it's the nature people who've then, they measure everything. They can actually do these things. We in culture tend to sort of humanities and well, we love it, we have these things. But when you start measuring species and when you start measuring the climate change, and I think that this is a very important part, and this is the power which people in the nature field have got over and above the culture, and the working together becomes absolutely critical. Thank you.
Yeah, I suppose one of the things that came to our, sort of fore, I suppose, was that there seems to be a different focus for World Heritage listing. It's not about, so much about the values and that, because some of the nominations that were coming up were looking at, the government putting theme parks on the properties, so it's all about the dollar and tourism. So it's an economic thing rather than, sort of looking at it from the natural or cultural point of view. And I'm not sure that how to change that, how we can change that and go back to what the real meaning of, sort of conservation and preservation under the world at a World Heritage level.
Yeah, thank you. The tourism question is a complicated one, and it is a driving force in a lot of nominations, rather than the heritage, the underlying heritage values themselves. Thank you, Chrissy, for your presentation, because you raised, as Mike said, two very important points about how we move forward. And one procedural point is how to simply ensure that the engagement policies with Indigenous peoples that are already on the books for the convention get enforced, which is something we should look at in anticipation of more advocacy, leading up to the 50th anniversary next year. That's an important point. The other point is how to get that policy extended and improved, obviously. And then the other point is your point about the criteria and how to ensure that even if you're looking at something for natural criteria, that the cultural aspects not get lost. And that's something that we'll discuss, in the online presentations. We'll get some presentations on that. It's an incredibly complicated subject and an important one for the convention, because on the one hand, the convention is the only international instrument out there that looks at nature and cultural, natural and cultural heritage together, which makes it incredibly unique and important. And then on the other hand, the reality is it doesn't do it very well, or doesn't do it as systematically as it should. So it's one of the themes with the World Heritage Convention is that there's always this dichotomy between the theory and the potential, which is, the theory is wonderful and the potential is enormous, but the practice doesn't always follow. And so that's part of our challenge. But I don't want to go on too long. If there are any final questions or comments to Chrissy or from Chrissy, if you have anything you'd like to add. No?
No.
No, okay, we're good. Thank you again, that's wonderful. And I hope we can continue this discussion after these next few days. So what I'd like to do is turn it over to Alec for the sort of last theme of the day. We've talked a little bit about the science, we've talked about the convention and its potential, and we've talked about the rights issue. A big challenge with the convention is how you advocate. It's how you campaign for change, and what are your options for doing so in, as Chrissy said, in a process that's very closed, and that's very rigid and often only allows opportunity for comment after the fact, after the decision's already been taken by the committee. And Alec Marr is someone who has deep experience on this particular issue, has been involved in environmental campaigns throughout Australia since the mid-80s, including working on getting new World Heritage Sites inscribed and protecting existing sites from threat. In the late 90s, in 1997, Alec took over the Wilderness Society Australia and transformed it into one of, or the preeminent conservation organization, nonprofit organization in Australia, and ran it very successfully for several years. Is now a consultant and also runs the World Heritage Program at the Australian Rainforest Conservation Society. He, along with Ivan Blakov, really has been at the forefront of thinking about what kind of networks we need in the World Heritage civil society community, was instrumental in launching the concept of World Heritage Watch, and also for this initiative, our World Heritage. So Alec, I'll turn it over to you as a deep thinker on how to advocate and campaign effectively in the World Heritage sphere. And I hope that we can use Alec's presentation as a launching pad for our discussions tomorrow afternoon on how to address threats to World Heritage sites specifically. Alec, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Cyril. I'll just share my screen. And oh, am I screen sharing at the moment?
Don't see it yet.
Just hang on a sec. I think it's about to load. There it is. Yes. Okay. Can people see that?
No.
Hello?
No.
Not yet. Did you click the green share screen button at the bottom?
I thought I did, but let me have another go. So, where is it? Sorry.
There you go.
How's that? Is that turned up?
Yes.
That's good.
Good.
That's
Great.
good. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Whew. Okay, so thanks, Cyril. Yeah, I'd like to just say a few words about the convention. I went to my first committee meeting in 1997 in Naples, and I had to fight my way in the door. The director of the World Heritage Centre told me that I wasn't welcome and I would not be admitted to the meeting if I turned up in Naples. So I went off, I got legal advice that said it was a public meeting unless the state parties agreed there was a closed meeting. And then I got back to the director of the centre at the time and said, I consider your treatment of me would be illegal if you don't admit me to the meeting. And I will turn up in Naples, and I have enough friends in other state parties. We'll spend the first day of the meeting talking about your illegal behaviour towards me unless I'm admitted to the meeting. At which point I got into the meeting. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because the convention and the running of the meetings in some ways has improved dramatically. In other ways, it's deteriorated dramatically. Once I got into the meeting, one of the most spectacular things I saw was the Russian delegation turned up and admitted that they were doing terrible things to Lake Baikal, primarily through pumping a lot of toxic waste from a pulp mill into Lake Baikal, and the committee had to put Lake Baikal on the endangered list immediately. And Delegate Blockov was very passionate about the need to do this and do it immediately. And of course, I didn't know any of these people. So I went, oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. The Australians would never do such a thing. Anyway, a little while later, Delegate Blockov comes to me and says, Mr. Maher, I'd like to meet with you. I went, oh, maybe I've upset the KGB, you know. Anyway, he said, no. He said, I'm from Greenpeace. My friend is the Environment Minister. He's being done over inside the Russian government. And so I've got one day to make trouble. Tomorrow morning, I'll be off the Russian delegation and we'll be back to being Greenpeace and we can hang out together. So that became the beginning of a long friendship between Ivan and I. And for the next decade, really, it was only myself and the Russians from civil society who turned up to any of these meetings. There was just no NGOs there. So you can see now with, for all the terrible things that happened at this last World Heritage Committee meeting, it's a lot easier to get in. The first meeting I went to, you weren't allowed to lobby delegates. You could provide information. You weren't allowed to approach delegates. You could stand within about 3 meters and use your body language to convey the fact that you'd like to talk to them, and they would either come over and talk to you or they would walk away. And if you did anything else, they'd just simply throw you out. So things are a lot easier in that sense than they were at my first meeting. But of course, in those days, the committee itself took its responsibilities around World Heritage much more seriously. None of the committee members trusted the others to support them if they were doing bad things to a World Heritage site. And all of the state parties lived in fear of the advisory bodies, because more or less whatever the advisory bodies recommended on a World Heritage site is what the committee adopted, because they saw their job as a technical body, not a political body. And that gave the advisory bodies enormous power. And one of the reasons that the convention did a better job of protecting World Heritage sites in those days than it does now is because although there was almost no engagement from civil society, they followed the committee, very closely followed the advice of the advisory bodies. So for people who are not experts on the World Heritage system, this diagram explains it in a very rudimentary way, but you know, as a mud map, I think it's pretty useful. So the most important thing here is civil society. You know, everybody on the planet, that's us. The UN system is a little subset of that. Then within the UN system itself, there's 120 signatories to the World Heritage Convention, and then at any one time, there's 21 canoe members. The technical advice comes in from the 3 advisory bodies, IUCN, ICROM, and ICOMOS. IUCN are the natural World Heritage experts, ICOMOS are the cultural experts, and ICROM are, you know, in a simplistic term, architectural experts. And so they also have their own memberships. So you could put a much more complicated kind of diagram here about the membership and how they work in those advisory bodies. But anyway, they formulate their advice. That goes to the World Heritage Centre, who are meant to operate as a secretariat. So really, they should be the paper shufflers on behalf of the committee. That's not exactly how it works, and that can be good, can be bad. The World Heritage Centre generally these days tries to play a moderating role between state parties and the advisory bodies instead of simply passing it on. Now, despite some of the current practices, if these advisory bodies are determined that their advice goes unadulterated to the committee, they can insist on that. And I've certainly been involved over the years where that's occurred. Mostly that doesn't happen these days. It tends to get moderated, and that's one of the reasons why you end up often with weaker decisions than you should. So anyway, 25 years ago, I talked about creating an international network of civil society to both support and pressure the 120 signatories to the World Heritage Convention to make sure that the integrity of the system was maintained. And everybody, because things were working pretty well at the time, everyone ignored me. So that's why I'm very excited to see our World Heritage process underway, because we have, if the World Heritage system is going to function, civil society's got to be a lot more engaged. And so I'm very pleased to see that someone other than me and Ivan Blokov, which was what it was like 25 years ago, are now much more engaged. There's vastly more people involved, and that is a great thing. So I'm just going to talk about two little campaigns that I was involved in where I learned the limitations of the World Heritage Convention. But the number one thing here to understand is the World Heritage Convention will not solve your problems. If you're a member of civil society, whether you're an Indigenous group, whether you're a natural advocacy group, the World Heritage Convention cannot solve your problems. In the end, you're going to have to solve your own problems domestically. But the World Heritage Convention can be an incredibly powerful tool, and particularly in functional democracies, the moral authority given to civil society through the World Heritage Convention can have a powerful impact on the state parties and also private enterprise players who are the problems in dealing with World Heritage sites. So this is a picture of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area in Tasmania. This has been at the centre of the whole World Heritage story in Australia for the last 30 years or more. The first major dispute around World Heritage in Australia was on the Franklin River, which is part of this site here. And the result was Australia created, as a way of our federal government bashing the state government into submission on this issue, they created a World Heritage Convention piece of legislation, and that was a weapon that the environment movement used to settle major land use disputes for the next 20 years. So at the centre of the stuff I was involved in are these massive trees. Tallest flowering plants on Earth, 90 metres tall, all being trashed by the logging industry. This is wilderness, never had a road in before. You know, incredible levels of carbon when it comes to climate change, but also incredible biodiversity. So, of course, civil society mobilised. That's me sitting up a tree in 1987. I'm 30 metres up a tree with a bunch of angry people in bulldozers under the tree trying to build a road. So I got arrested quite a few times during that process. But the point here was this built a massive constituency across Australia, not just in Tasmania, for the protection of these sites. We included, these disputes went on for decades, and the committee was critical in saying these forests should be on the World Heritage List. And it meant that every time any conversation around protection or the heritage of these places came up, people would simply point to the fact that the World Heritage Committee wanted these sites on the World Heritage List because of their outstanding universal value. We also ran consumer campaigns to beat up the company who were the main destroyers of these forests. And this is a rally. I'm down here on the front line with another friend of mine, Christine Milne, who was an IUCN councillor. This is 20,000 people marching through the streets of Hobart. And this rally is to beat up the bank that was funding the company that was chopping down the forest. Now, why is this important? It's because this is the kind of constituency that you need to build to put pressure on the state party. And in a context like this, decisions from the World Heritage Committee have a very powerful impact. But if you don't do this, no amount of decisions from the committee will help you. One of the reasons that we could transfer the pressure from the domestic campaign to the World Heritage Committee is because this guy, a guy called Lincoln Siliakis, he was based in Paris, and he could go to UNESCO headquarters and pass our scientific information and latest updates on to committee members and ask for their help. And so you've got to be able to build your own domestic campaign, and then you've got to interact in a sensible way with committee members so they can understand it. The important thing to understand about the committee members is these days they've got 1,000 sites they have to deal with. A whole range of them have a lot of significant problems. And so if you can't explain what your issues are in a very succinct way that's scientifically credible, they're just not going to pay attention to you. They don't have the brain space to do it. And this is like a funny photo because after decades of fighting with the Australian government at the committee member, what we're really doing at the committee level was having a massive domestic dispute. In 2013 at Phnom Penh, basically, I became a de facto part of the Australian delegation because the government had changed. They'd agreed to put these sites on the World Heritage List, and they were in fact inscribed in 2013. But after decades of fighting through the committee, but the committee decisions kept this issue alive through every environmental assessment for like 20 years. And then the government changed again. This is us in 2014, when I'm not part of the Australian delegation, because myself and Lincoln again have just led an international campaign to beat up the Australian government because they wanted to remove 170,000 hectares of the forest that they just put on the list in 2013. Now, luckily, again, we could get directly to the committee members, and it took them 7 minutes to humiliate the Australian government and kick the proposal out. This is another issue that I was involved in, assisting the traditional owners of the area around the Jabiluka uranium lease in Kakadu. This is one of our biggest World Heritage sites here in Australia. The traditional owners, the Mirarr, were totally opposed to a new mine being developed inside the World Heritage Site. So this is me and the two traditional owners, Jackie Katona and Yvonne Margarula, outside UNESCO headquarters in Paris. And we went to the committee and said, we're about to have a massive domestic fight with the Australian government, and we need your help, because without it, they're going to build this mine and damage the land of these people. So again, what we did was put together a major domestic campaign. This is myself and a friend chained to the drilling rig out on the lease as they started to try and build the mine. In the end, over 500 people were arrested. This is me being escorted by a policeman off to the paddy wagon. And this is what they're doing inside the World Heritage Site, which they claimed was having no environmental impact at all. So after I was arrested, I went off to UNESCO. So here is Bert von Drost, the director of the World Heritage Centre. This is Francisco, anyway, he was the chair of the World Heritage Committee at the time. And this guy was the deputy director of IUCN. So the committee made a decision to send a field mission to inspect things. And at the So that kicked the whole World Heritage fight into high gear. But we knew that we were never ultimately going to win at the committee level. We had to demolish the mine and the company. So part of what we did is, in order to get the mine operational, they needed $200 million. So we attacked the bank that was going to lend them the money. So we were closing down like 40 branches of the bank on any given day. This went on for about, I don't know, a year. And in the end, they decided not to lend them the money. In the end, we ran a corporate campaign which damaged the share price of the company to a point where it was taken over by Rio Tinto. And then we had a meeting with Rio Tinto, and they agreed to close the mine, to rehabilitate the site. And since then, they've now signed legal documents with the traditional owners to say they won't go back near that mine until and if the traditional owners ever agree to a new mining operation. So Kakadu and Jabiluka have been protected thanks to the convention. Without the convention, we wouldn't have got that outcome. There's no doubt about that. It disrupted the committee for 5 years. It was one of, probably even to now, is still the biggest fight in the convention's history. There will be bigger ones. You can see things building on places like the Barrier Reef. But the reason that I wanted to tell those two stories is a lot of people, when they go to the committee, literally turn up to a committee meeting. They've never met people in Paris. They don't know them at all. They don't have a domestic campaign at all. And they say, we've got a big problem. We'd like you to help with the problem. And they're not going to get a satisfactory outcome if that's all you do. So that's really the main point I'm making. But if you integrate the World Heritage work with your domestic campaign, then it can be a very powerful tool. So I might leave it there, Saul.
Thank you, Alec. That's wonderful. So I would encourage you, if you have any questions for Alec, please don't hesitate. We will have an opportunity tomorrow afternoon. I am conscious that we're over our anticipated time frame of about an hour and a half, but we don't have to go. We can stay a few more minutes. Any questions for Alec?
I just like to, first of all, I'm full of admiration for Alec, and I think that he has given us the actual importance of the circularity about the whole interrelationship. So there's now, it's not 120 state parties, it's almost a universal. I think there's only one place, so it's 190, over 190 people, just to have to update that. But I would like to really ask, there was 2 years that you actually wore a suit, Alec. Now, in other words, what I want to really ask you is that those 2 years where I saw you in a suit in 2013, 2014, that is then you joined the system. So what was the effect of that? Was that effective because you had been out of the system, or should you in fact, how critical was that? As having been a committee member, I'd like to add another point, is that 2011, they suddenly opened the committee to television and filming. And that made a big change, because then representatives spoke to the cameras. And when there was no cameras there, it was a very important part. So it was a double-edged sword, which happened. So, as I said, my first question is that, did you feel within the system, without the system? And then really to actually look is that we're talking always about national interests. That was the same with the Oryx, which was the mining again in Oman. So do you see also about at what point then the conflicting parts of the national interests involved, and it's always been the mining parts of it. And my last comment really is that I think we have to engage social media. That is where our power is. Because they've opened up the World Heritage Committee to the cameras, and the ambassadors now, as opposed to professional representatives on the committee, speak to the cameras, then we also have to start speaking to the cameras, and the 2 minutes in the committee are not relevant anymore. And this is where I think that we can then make a really big change. And I just would like to give more power to your elbow. Well done, Alec. I'm pleased to be associated with you over the years.
Well, I'll respond to some of those things. Look, learning how to operate in the system is very difficult because as you know, Mike, there are always many agendas running inside the committee. That's always been the case. And you really have to, as best you can, understand what's motivating people, where the alliances between various state parties are going, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of complexity in that. If you go into hostile territory, then you should wear camouflage, which is what the suits were. I've been in any of these forums, there are always great people also in disguise, trying to get the best outcomes for nature. And you just got to find who those people are. I think just in response to the televised, the use of television for the committee, one of the people who pushed for that was the Australian delegate I'd been fighting with for a decade over Tasmania's forests, because he had a job to do, but he really was alarmed at the slide of the committee, and he thought that would improve things. Now, it kind of has a bit, but one of the reasons I'm very excited about the Our Heritage initiative is because without an organised civil society to take advantage of that, it doesn't have anywhere near the impact that it should. And in a perfect world, and we're far from perfect at this stage, you would have well-organised constituencies in each country where it's safe enough to organise, that can put pressure on state parties so that some ambassador says some outrageous thing about a World Heritage Site, and then the next morning there's just outrage around the world that this guy becomes famous for his stupidity. Right now they do say really stupid things and it goes off into the ether. But I think if you could consistently embarrass people on a big enough scale, you would change their behaviour. There's no doubt about it. That was really the idea behind the televisation of the committee meetings, and those opportunities are still there. There just hasn't been a well-organised civil society to take advantage of it. I certainly wanted to go beat up one of the Indian ambassadors at one stage of the game. I wanted to run a global campaign against him because he would just get up and attack the advisory bodies. He would just do unbelievable things. Anyway, so I think with the, we're now, I hope, at the beginning of an engagement of broader civil society. It'll be patchy, that's okay. You know, there's no other planet to move on. We have to get this sorted out here. You know, so we're going to, hopefully, this is the start of a self-organising groups of people who take their own areas of interest and use the convention as a tool in a broader strategy to protect their natural and cultural sites.
Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, and maybe just to, well, bring to people's attention who aren't aware of this, that in Australia, and perhaps it's specific to Australia, or it's particularly evident in Australia, or evidence not the word, the World Heritage is of particular significance in Australia because of our constitutional division of powers between the federal government and the state government, it turns out that the only form of protection, or the only conservation, the only legal conservation instrument that can protect our natural heritage areas is World Heritage listing, because it overrides, because it's the federal government's got a head of power to override state law to give effect to a treaty obligation. It can evoke that World Heritage head of power to override a state government that wants to mine or log a natural area. And many of our categories of formal protected area, many of the categories of protected areas that are within our national reserve system are defined under state law, which allow logging and mining. And so the most powerful conservation tool we have in Australia is to get a natural area or a cultural landscape listed on the World Heritage, because that enables the federal government to override anything a state government may wish to do in terms of damaging that World Heritage area. The only reason why
Brendan,
the great... Yes?
Just a question. Has that ever been tested in the courts? Is there a particular ruling that recognized that?
Yeah.
Or was it just...
Yeah, that was the Franklin Dam decision. That was a High Court decision.
So it was the Franklin Dam that, okay.
Yeah, that was the one that established that the World Heritage Treaty met the constitutional head of power. So, you know, the main reason we don't have fossil fuel mining on the Great Barrier Reef is because of World Heritage listing. The reason why we don't have new uranium mining in Kakadu is because of World Heritage listing. The reason why the old growth forests in Tasmania, the only old growth forest in Tasmania that is not being wood chipped, is because of World Heritage listing. And it's been extraordinary that the federal government commitment to World Heritage has been very stable, irrespective of which party's been in power. And even, I mean, it wavered a bit under Tony Abbott, but other than that, it's, you know, even our conservative governments have stood by what the World Heritage commitment requires. The Great Barrier Reef, again, I know Imogen can talk more about this. And whilst there's a lot of debate around the climate change issue, you know, the government's spending, you know, they've still got this commitment to World Heritage, and successive federal governments are prepared to use that head of power to override what state governments want to do. So this, you know, has been the legal mechanism by which the civil society action Alec has talked about in terms of mounting civil society campaigns in support of World Heritage listing. You know, it's really been the lever that civil society has been able to make use of.
And Cyril, just to finish off maybe with the provocation and to talk about that broader use of civil society, if we had a properly operating convention where civil society and the broader UN system was properly engaged in the convention, basically where state parties are deliberately and willfully damaging World Heritage sites, there would be massive economic and political consequences for them. So, for instance, when Tanzania decides to smash up whole chunks of Selous, why are there European donors, aid donors, still giving them money? Why are their companies still allowed to operate in that country? There is a whole lot of mechanisms beyond the World Heritage Convention itself that the broader UN system could bring to bear on state parties who are willfully destroying World Heritage sites. And that's the sort of thing that we should be aiming at going into the future, so that they don't just cut some cosy deal with their mates who happen to be on the committee at the time. The broader UN system comes in. Like, we know the UN is not going to go and invade a country because they're damaging a World Heritage Site, but they can certainly mobilise some serious political and economic consequences which would make state parties think twice. And these are entirely absent currently, and this is the sort of thing that we as broader civil society should be trying to create. So there are mechanisms beyond the committee itself.
Other comments? I'm seeing the chat and Jessica's comments about how Everglades and getting water flowing to the Everglades was in fact something that was made feasible by the Clinton administration leveraging the World Heritage Convention. Jessica, would you like to say a few more words about that? Or something
No,
else?
I don't actually know much more about it than that. It's been the story that I've heard, so I just wanted to flag it. But actually, I do have another question for Alec, which is in this committee meeting, when some of the very reactionary state parties were trying to overrule what the advisory bodies had recommended, they came up with statements like, if you just want us to pass what the advisory bodies recommend, we should just go home. We don't see the point of this committee in any way. And so I would like to hear Alec's thoughts on this, because you mentioned that it used to be that they did just pass what the advisory bodies were recommending. So what was the kind of sovereignty movement at that time, and how was it overruled?
Well, it's just been, look, the answer is there's always been some nuance in this. The reason that the committee has been given a little bit of leeway is because, in theory, what they're supposed to do is simply rubber stamp what the advisory bodies do. Now, in practice, that's not always possible. And so they've been given a little bit of leeway and say, well, look, we know what we should do technically, because it's meant to be a technical body. But if we do that, we might bring the only friendly government down who can solve our problem. So we better give that friendly government 6 months to solve the problem, or we need to give them some money to enable this solution to be adopted. That's the kind of leeway that people initially kind of envisioned, and that was the practice back in, say, 1997. But since then, as more state parties have signed up to the convention, more and more of those people who signed to the convention have signed for economic reasons rather than heritage reasons. They've either they want the status of having some World Heritage Sites, or they've got some sites they want to use for tourism or a whole range of other things. But a bunch of those state parties, I think they've signed up in bad faith. They never signed up to protect outstanding universal values for the whole of mankind for its heritage value. They signed up because they had an economic reason to get a tourism operation or something like that. And for those state parties, it was always about self-interest and state party sovereignty. We do what we like. And that's what we saw with the Oryx Reserve. The whole thing was, I'm not going to bore you with it, but it was a total disgrace. It should never have gone on. And then when they tried to take it off, the World Heritage mechanism inside the committee really kicked in, and they said, well, it's not up to you to take it off. Once you put it on the site, it becomes the responsibility of the committee, and we're not going to take it off. So this fight went on for a couple of years, and then eventually they moved in with machine guns, shot all the Oryx, and started drilling holes anyway, at which point eventually the committee just gave up and went, okay, well, fine. Now, that's really the whole sordid history of that particular site. But so what should have happened then is, right, okay, now you're going to suffer a whole lot of consequences through the UN system for this behaviour. There have been none. And so what we need here is what everyone who's been around the committee a long time agrees is you've got to, if you want to improve the behaviour of the state parties, you've got to instill the fear of the committee. Now, what do I mean by that? That state parties, like Australia can be one of the best state parties, but they're regularly one of the worst. They were the absolute disgrace on Kakadu. Their behaviour on the Barrier Reef right now is disgraceful. There's just no way around that. But what we need is create a situation where the state party who wants to behave badly has no confidence that the rest of the committee will support them in their bad behaviour. And what Australia believes at the moment is if they lobby and pressure people enough, they can get away with anything, and which is what they're doing right now. So, you're on mute, Cyril.
Sorry, I think we should wrap it up here, unless there are any closing comments. We will reconvene tomorrow at the same time to continue this discussion and hopefully get more concrete about what we can do and how. One idea which we can bat around tomorrow, but which I'll just get on the record now for people to think about, is I think it would be extremely interesting to have a good documentary film produced on World Heritage, and looking in particular at, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 natural sites, 2 or 3 or 4 cultural sites, and tracking them over time, and tracking their exceptional values, tracking the debate, you know, in the committee, tracking the outrageous things that have been said. Obviously, this needs to be done for important discussions that occurred after 2011 so that we have the footage available. But, you know, if there were someone creative and smart who could really get to work on characterizing what's happening, it might take a couple of years, but it might really help, because I do think this is an important concept. It's an important international mechanism. These are important values, and we should, you know, see if we can't capture that in something, you know, longer. Doesn't have to be an hour and a half, but, you know, maybe even, you know, less than an hour. But anyway, for discussion tomorrow. Thank you all for joining. We'll reconvene, and in the meantime, we'll get some more podcasts up onto the Our World Heritage website. And please spread the word so that we might get a few more people. We don't need a huge number of people online tomorrow, but it would be good to have a few more. So let's try to get a few more between now and then. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks.
Cheers.